All right, here we go with section 3, and this is the focus question. Unlike Kennedy, who came from a wealthy and powerful family and seemed to view success as a birthright, Lyndon B. Johnson grew up poor in the impoverished Texas Hill Country and struggled to achieve wealth and power. By the 1950s, he was Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate, but he never forgot the poor white and Mexican children he had taught in the 1930s. More than Kennedy, he was committed to New Deal social programs that assisted the less fortunate. Immediately upon taking office, Johnson called on Congress to enact the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had championed. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which barred racial discrimination in employment, institutions such as hospitals and schools, and privately owned public accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, and theaters. It also banned discrimination on the grounds of sex, although this provision was added by opponents of civil rights who hoped to derail the bill and embraced by liberal and female members of Congress. Johnson knew that many whites opposed the law, and he feared the South would turn Republican. But the 1964 law did not address blacks' rights to vote in the South. That summer, a coalition of civil rights groups started a voter registration drive in Mississippi. Hundreds of white college students from the North traveled to take part in the campaign called Freedom Summer. Violence was quick and deadly, including bombings, beatings, and the murder of 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Though many black civil rights workers had been killed, the deaths of the 2 white youths grabbed national attention and revealed federal indifference to violence against citizens claiming their rights. Freedom Summer also led to the dramatic campaign by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to take the seats of the state's all-white official party at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. As blacks were barred from Democratic activities or registering to vote, civil rights activists created the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was open to all citizens. Fannie Lou Hamer of the MFDP captivated the country in televised hearings in which she recounted her history of poverty and beatings by police for civil rights works. Johnson feared that Southern Democrats would abandon the party if the MFDP delegates were seated, and the MFDP rejected a compromise to seat only 2 black delegates. The 1964 Democratic Convention weakened blacks' faith that they could use the political system and foretold the break between Democratic liberals and the civil rights movement. But the movement rallied behind Johnson's campaign for re-election. Johnson's Republican opponent was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, whose 1960 book, The Conscience of a Conservative, had sold more than 3 million copies. Goldwater demanded a more aggressive Cold War stance, but mostly criticized internal threats to freedom, especially the New Deal welfare state. He called for private charity to replace public welfare and Social Security and the abolition of the graduated income tax. Goldwater also voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But Democrats' portrayal of Goldwater as an extremist who would abandon Social Security and risk nuclear war won Johnson an overwhelming victory. Democrats also took 2-to-1 majorities in both houses of Congress. But the 1964 campaign also launched the modern conservative movement. Goldwater carried 5 Deep South states, and George Wallace, the segregationist Democratic governor of Alabama, had done well in primaries in northern states like Indiana and Wisconsin. Also in 1964, California voters approved Proposition 14, which repealed a 1963 law that banned racial discrimination in real estate sales, celebrated by conservatives as a move that would give white homeowners freedom against government interference. The Goldwater campaign and other stirrings showed that the 1960s had a conservative side. In 1960, students inspired by the conservative intellectual William F. Buckley gathered at his home in Sharon, Connecticut, and formed the Young Americans for Freedom. The YAF's Sharon statement advocated the free market as the basis of personal freedom, limited government, and the destruction of global communism in the Cold War. YAF members became Goldwater shock troops in his campaign. Goldwater also found support in the suburbs of California and the Southwest, where immigrants from elsewhere in the United States had come to work in defense-related industries. These suburbanites were the base for later conservative insurgencies. Goldwater's winning of 5 Deep South states also showed that Republicans might take advantage of white resentments against civil rights and move the South away from the Democrats. Although conservatives eventually abandoned the blatant language of racial superiority and inferiority, their calls for law and order and their stigmatization of welfare had strong racial overtones. In early 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. launched a voting rights drive in Selma, Alabama. Defying a ban by Governor Wallace, tried to lead a march from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery. State police met the marches with cattle prods, whips, and tear gas. Once more, images of brutal police attacks on nonviolent demonstrators flashed on televisions worldwide. The government was forced to take action, and Johnson quickly asked Congress to pass a law securing the right to vote. Congress soon enacted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed federal officials to register voters. Black Southerners finally regained the suffrage that had been denied them since the end of the 19th century. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution also outlawed the poll tax, which had prevented poor blacks and some whites from voting in the South. By 1965, the belief spread by the civil rights movement that racism could no longer create second-class citizens affected other policy debates. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act ended the national origins quota system of immigration that had excluded Asians and restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The law established new, racially neutral criteria for immigration, including family reunification and the demand for skills needed in America. Yet, because of growing hostility in the Southwest to Mexican immigration, the law for the first time sharply limited immigration from the Western Hemisphere to 120,000 per year. This provision created the category of illegal aliens for migrants from elsewhere in the Americas. The law set the quota for the rest of the world at 170,000 per year. Exceptions for refugees from communist countries soon let immigration exceed the limits. Although immigrants were only 5% of the nation's population at the time, the reform caused a dramatic shift to Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia as the sources of immigration. After his 1964 election victory, Johnson outlined the most sweeping plan since the New Deal for government action to promote the general welfare. Johnson's programs of 1965 to 1967, known as the Great Society, provided health services to the poor and elderly in the new Medicaid and Medicare programs and poured federal funds into education and urban development. New cabinet-level offices, such as the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development, and new agencies such as the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission and a national public broadcasting network were established. These measures greatly expanded the federal government's powers and completed and extended the social agenda, except national health insurance, that had stalled in Congress since 1938. Yet the Great Society was a response to prosperity, not depression. In the mid-1960s, the economy was expanding, fueled by higher government spending and a tax cut passed in 1964 for individuals and businesses. Johnson and Democratic liberals believed economic growth would fund more government programs and improve Americans' quality of life. The War on Poverty was the centerpiece of the Great Society. Launched in 1964, this effort was inspired in part by politicians' rediscovery of poverty amid 1950s affluence. In 1962, Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, showed that 40 to 50 million Americans still lived in poverty in urban and rural areas removed from middle-class life and consciousness. Harrington showed that the mechanization of agriculture and automation of industry had cut jobs for the unskilled. The Civil Rights Movement highlighted the problem of poverty for blacks, but Harrington showed that the majority of the poor were white. While Democrats during the New Deal had attributed poverty to an imbalance of economic power and flawed economic institutions, the Johnson administration believed poverty was caused by a lack of skills, proper attitudes, and work habits. The War on Poverty did not directly fight poverty through efforts like work programs, spreading unions, or preventing businesses from moving production to the low-wage South or overseas. It did not address economic changes that reduced well-paid factory jobs and left poor rural and urban families with few opportunities. Perhaps the most successful and popular program was food stamps, a form of direct aid. But the War on Poverty sought to equip the poor with skills and motivate them. A new Office of Economic Opportunity created Head Start, which is early childhood education, job training, legal services, college scholarships, and Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, which is a domestic version of the Peace Corps. It also created community action programs that required poor people to participate in forming local policies, which fostered resentment among local officials used to controlling federal funds. Johnson defended the Great Society in the New Deal language of freedom reinforced by the Civil Rights Movement. Recognizing that black poverty caused by past and present racism was different from white poverty, he tried to redefine the relationship between freedom and equality. He argued that economic liberty was more than equal opportunity. But while Johnson's Great Society may not have achieved equality, it did reaffirm the idea of social citizenship. It was the greatest effort in American history to mobilize the powers of the federal government to aid less fortunate Americans, especially those, like blacks, who had been excluded from original New Deal entitlements like Social Security. Combined with incredible economic growth, the war on poverty reduced poverty rates from 22 to 13% of American families during the 1960s. But the amount spent on the programs was too low to end poverty or transform life in poor urban areas. Today, the historic gap between whites and blacks in education, income, and access to skilled jobs had greatly narrowed. But deindustrialization and urban decay, combined with residential segregation, kept the wealth of white households 10 times as great as that of blacks and left nearly a quarter of all black children in poverty. So, that's section 3. We'll be back for section 4.